Hello, everybody. My name is Gabriel Magni, aka Kid Riot. There's going to be a lot of issues with the streams, probably a lot of drop frames. I don't know what's going on, but with me, I'm proud to say, is the man, the myth, the legend himself, the man with the former golden locks, the man who formerly worked at SOE, now Daybreak Games, Matt Higby.
Hey guys, how's it going?
So actually, I'm really glad you decided to do this. I know it's like a lot going on for you and a lot going on for everybody, but I thought this is a really cool opportunity. And I'm glad you be able to get on board and do this interview. Let's just get
Yeah,
started. So what's life been like
sure.
for you, man? Like, what are you doing now that you left Daybreak?
Well, I mean, you know, it's been about a week now, a little over a week. I've been, not doing too much to be honest with you. I've been, um, going to the gym, trying to kind of get my head straight, getting used to getting out of bed and not having to go to work. It's quite a change in terms of uh, style and sense of purpose and all that kind of stuff. When you don't have a job to go to in the morning, you got to figure out what you're going to do. But it's been cool. I've been meeting up with friends and kind of having lunch with colleagues here and there and talking about next steps, and it's exciting.
Yeah, like I know you've talked about a lot about like esports and stuff, or like computer games in general. Like, do you play any? Like, are you playing any more now, or what that's like?
Well,
What's
the
that like?
last game that I played before PlanetSide 2, or the last game that I guess I played most recently besides PlanetSide 2, was the Hardline beta. I was playing that one quite a bit, but I haven't been playing a ton of games the last week, actually. For whatever reason, I got my office set up downstairs, but I've just sort of been more interested in going outside and going for a walk or taking my dog to the beach or whatever than sitting down and playing games right now. But I'm sure as the time stretches on, I'll be much more um, interested in playing games and filling my time with games.
Yeah, I can see that happening. It's like one of those things where it's like you've basically your past 4 years of your life have been consumed by this one game. Like, I'm guessing like just taking your shirt off. Like I said, what I think on your Twitter it says now not wearing pants.
Yeah, right. No longer wearing pants.
Yeah, just saying fix the hitching. Like I said, I'm sorry guys. I don't know what's going on with the internet. I tested it earlier and I wasn't dropping frames, so for some reason I'm dropping a ton of frames right now. I really don't know what's going on. If
Is the
anything,
audio going through? Can they hear anything?
yeah, I think it's the audio might be fine. I just raised your volume, but I think it's like stuttering. Just made me kind of reminiscent of a lot of the problems that were PlanetSide has been going through for long. But let's get back to the I guess the task at hand. So why did you end up deciding to leave Daybreak? What was going through your head when that decision?
Well, I mean, for the last year, I guess, I had been thinking about what I was going to do next. And, anytime you're working on a project for as long as I had been working on PlanetSide 2, we basically just hit 4 years in terms of working on the project, considering pre-release and post-release. Um, it starts getting fatiguing, and you start thinking about what you want to work on next. And there's a lot of really exciting things going on at SOE right now, or at Daybreak right now. But in terms of like what I really wanted to work on and the types of games that I really wanted to work on, PlanetSide 2 was basically my game at Daybreak. It was the only one that really um, sort of rang all my bells, and the only one that I really was passionate and fired up about. So just like going and working on another project there, I didn't feel like I could bring the same level of excitement to that as I did with PlanetSide 2. So it didn't feel like I would be able to, you know, give it everything that I needed to
Right.
be able to, work on one of those games. And I think a lot of people don't understand when you're working. Um, I think especially in a position like my position, you really have to be you have to care a lot about the game. You have to really just surround yourself with it and dive in 100%. So I knew that any other project there, I wouldn't feel exactly that same way. Um, and so it was kind of it made it an easier decision for sure. But in terms of like timing, man, I would have loved to have been there for several more months, working on PlanetSide 2 for a few more months for sure. I didn't want to leave right when I left. It just so happened that the layoffs were going on and the restructuring was happening. And it was the best time in terms of overall disruption, because it would have been heartbreaking to me to leave the team 6 months ago, even though I was thinking about it. It was
Right.
heartbreaking for me to leave the team when I left. It would have been heartbreaking for me to leave the team 6 months from now. Like there wouldn't have been a time that I could have left the team and had it not be something that like was really impactful and heartbreaking to me. I don't think there would have been a time when it would have meant any more or meant any less to the team. So the fact that the team was changing over and sort of um, looking forward to new challenges and figuring out new solutions to those new challenges, it just made sense for me to exit when I did. But I definitely didn't feel like I was jumping off of a sinking ship or anything like that. If anything, I think that PlanetSide 2, especially being able to launch on the consoles in the next couple months, they are in some of the best shape that that project has ever been in terms of potential right now. So I would have loved to have stuck around several more months. It was purely just a matter of the timing, it was the least disruptive time for me to go.
And it's just something. I mean, you said a lot of things that kind of stuck in my mind right now. But one of them was about like you wanted to say if you're going to do this, dive in all the way. And I know even before PlanetSide 2 was released, you're talking about like pre or maybe around beta. Like you started, it was you, I think Tramel and Maggie who were kind of like the face of PlanetSide 2, right? So you had to do
Yeah,
a lot of interviews, a lot of PR, and but not only did you like do that, but you did it throughout the entire time. Did that kind of like increase the level of fatigue, or do you think it was cool for you to be able to like represent the game, or how did that make you feel?
man, that's a question that we could talk about for an entire hour just in itself. I think honestly, um, I didn't start on the PlanetSide 2 team expecting to have the sort of cult of personality thing build up that did. I wasn't expecting to do this whole haircutting ceremony or any of that kind of shit. Like I just that wasn't in my head when I started working on PlanetSide 2. When I started working on PlanetSide 2, I was excited about being able to make a groundbreaking, audacious, crazy game in a
Right,
genre that I was really passionate about and using technology that I thought was really exciting. The whole kind of developer celebrity thing that came up around it was weird to deal with for sure. Um, I felt like I was good at doing it, so I was happy to do it. I felt like I was good at doing interviews, and I felt like I was good at representing the game in terms of being able to talk about the things that the team was working on. And I had a really obviously uh, specific view of what was happening in the game and what was being built in the game because I was one of the team directors. So I was
right,
literally shaping what was going to be in the game. So it was easy for me to talk about it. And if I wanted to, say, hey, we're going to do this thing, it was true because we were the ones who were deciding those things. So it was cool and it was fun and um, it was very kind of enthralling to do it, but it did kind of become a distraction at a certain point, and it was tiring in a lot of ways that I didn't necessarily expect to. So on one hand, when you would have people on Twitter or whatever, sending you messages saying, "Hey, you made the coolest game in the world," or "You made my favorite game," like you would love that, and it would be so cool to be able to share that kind of stuff with the team.
right.
But on the other hand, like when people would just like shit on me or whatever for something that honestly had like so little to do with me that I'm probably one of the people screaming about it back at work too, but I'm getting yelled at it on the other end.
Right.
It's just frustrating, and it kind of compounds the stress already of trying to build a crazy game and all the work that's involved in trying to make a really big audacious game. So that the additional stress that kind of came on from that was, I mean, it wasn't something I ever hated, but it wasn't something that I expected when I started working on the project.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things too where it's like you're almost like I don't want to say a victim, but you know what I mean, like a victim of your own success, right? Because like I said, you were really good at it, and just everybody else got better and better at it. Like when you had Command Center with Tramel, like it was awesome. Remember the first time I went to go see you guys? I had no idea what to expect because because we were talking earlier before the show how people have this perception of you as creative director, then as Matt Higby, and then as this whatever kind of person. But then when I actually got to see those things, like I don't know, it's like almost like you guys were like you said, almost like rock stars. Like, do you think that's prevalent in like the video game industry? We're talking about like perceptions, right? So do you think that's kind of like prevalent? Do you think it's a good thing, or do you think it's kind of like what you were saying, where it can be distracting, taken away maybe potentially from your job or from the focus on the game itself?
Um, well, I don't know. I think that it really depends on what you do with it. It's just like I don't know. The whole media landscape right now is very personality driven. You know, brands like personal brands mean a lot. People want to trust another person now, and people have a like personal connection with products now in a way that didn't really exist before. So, you know, I don't know if it was um, like an intentional process that we really decided, hey, you know what, we wanted to build this personal connection. But I do know that we absolutely wanted to have um, as open of a development process as we could have. So I don't know if you can separate those two things. I don't know if you can be open about here's the game and here's the people who are working on it and here's the excitement level and the passion that the people on the team here have for this game without there being some development of personalities and sort of a fondness for certain people and certain you know uh, roles on the team. So I think those two things are intertwined. I think that they are. I think developing a game when you know that there's people out there who specifically care about the things that you're doing is a really wonderful experience. So I wouldn't like the idea of working someplace where you're just sort of like firewalled off from your audience, where they don't know you and you don't know them. And maybe there's community managers that do all the interaction in between to like let you know the polling data on what you need to do, just so that you don't get stressed out at hearing the feedback when it is negative and it's going to be negative at some point. I think that the value of the communication is just too good. And I know for like the first month or 2 months post launch in the game, in between playing the game, like if you came into my office at any given time, it looked like I was the fucking architect. I had my monitor set up with like 20 streams going on each one of them that I was watching. And I thought it was one of the coolest things in the world to be able to watch through other people's eyes when they were frustrated, and you get to see the little webcam and, hey, here's this thing that made this person upset while they were playing, and you know they couldn't hide it. They said fuck, and you could tell they were pissed off.
Right.
Like being able to see that level of you know, here's direct feedback, as direct as you can get, helps you make better decisions about making a game. So I think that the open development process and being able to show people kind of the behind the scenes of what's going on in the game is a really good thing and a really healthy thing. I think that being able to build a personal relationship between developers and players is a really healthy thing too. I wasn't expecting it to be exactly the way it was. In a lot of ways, I wasn't kind of prepared for it, and it was something that was fatiguing. I think that maybe it's something that game developers sort of need to be more professionally prepared for, maybe, because there's not like a crash course that you take and here's how you deal with a bunch of upset people. You know, as a game designer, I didn't take a class in public relations necessarily. You know what I mean? And
Right.
we get like coaching on how to talk to media and stuff like that, but nobody ever really gives you any sort of, hey, here's how you deal with really angry people, or, you know, here's some riot control techniques that you might need to use in your personal life or whatever. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's none of that.
Or like
No one
a way to tune out the negative, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I think anybody who's a creative personality, whether you're a streamer or a fucking photographer that puts your stuff on Flickr, or, you know, you're somebody who writes, you know, Harry Potter fan fiction, um, you care about people's response to the thing that you create. So you're always going to be, if you are a real creator, then you care a lot about wanting to see everybody's feedback. If 80% of it is good and 20% of it's bad, you really want to see that 20% because you want 100% of it to be good, you know? So
Right.
even though there's the tried and true, you always hear the negative, like the people who are happy, you don't hear from that much, which is true. The people that are happy, you, in a lot of cases, like their opinion almost doesn't matter to you as much either. You know what I mean? The people who are unhappy, their opinion matters because they're the ones you're still trying to get. They're the one you're still trying to romance and still trying to be like, hey, you know what? I know I have a chance with you still. You're
Right.
writing this negative thing, so I have a chance to get you still. And it's like, it kills you sometimes to not be able to get them.
So let's talk about that. I'm gonna jump around. I know I had my list of questions. Let's talk about the idea of feedback, right? I mean, primarily, first it was what the official forums. I think you guys had a presence on Twitter, and then all of a sudden the huge shift went to Reddit, right? And whatever, we won't talk about Reddit itself, but there's a lot of feedback, and a lot of the common phrase is, "I'm passionate about this game, so why the fuck aren't you doing this? Why the fuck are you doing that?" Right? So, like, how do you filter out like what you said, like what's actually not just happy or pissed, but what's useful? Or like, have you ever taken an idea from somebody that you saw on Reddit and said, "Hey, maybe we should do that," and then actually did it? Or like, how did you kind of like shuffle that information?
Well, I don't know, man. It's Here's one of the things about like ideas and stuff on Reddit
Right.
is it would be very rare for me to come across an idea on Reddit. And this is not to belittle anybody's ideas. Everybody has fucking amazing ideas.
Right.
But, I worked at essentially an idea factory, and it would be rare for me to come across an idea that I hadn't already seen at some point or some form or some iteration of an idea that was like completely brand new and completely gobsmackingly like, oh shit, like that's a fucking amazing idea.
Right.
Um, I can't even point to a single time where I was just like, holy shit, that's the one. Often we would see things echoed in community comments that would be like, oh, well, remember when we talked about this thing? Well, there's a thread right now on Reddit where they're kind of talking about that too. And it seems like a lot of people are really into that idea. And here's some like minor variations that people have thought on it. And oh, check it out. This was something that I thought was really cool. We never even thought of this. Like that's where a lot of times you would see like some offshoot or some like small kind of tributary of an idea that was something brand new and different. Um, because the people who are working on the game, honest to God, are sitting on the office 40 hours a week, but they're thinking about the game nonstop. Game developers are obsessive people, and they go home and read boards and go home and watch other games on Twitch, watch their own games on Twitch, play their own games, play other games, and it all sort of goes into the machine and gets thought about and cranked out, and solutions come out every once in a while. In a lot of cases about something that you're not even necessarily trying to ideate at the time.
Right.
But I always found those feedback threads and idea threads and all that kind of stuff super, super helpful because they were great to be able to be almost like an airing of ideas. You know what I mean? Other people are presenting ideas and saying, hey, here's my idea for this thing. And everybody's like, fuck yeah, great idea. This is killer. This is really a super good idea. I'll give you a perfect example. Prime example, very recent. So Vindicor posted today about ideas for upgradable turrets. That's an idea that's been bouncing around and talked about at work since, I don't know, sometime early last year. I wrote a little brief doc for, and it was something that I actually had Kevmo pegged to work on this year, which was just creating the ability for outfits who owned a base to change the configuration and upgrade the base turrets in different ways. All the way up to being able to do automated base turrets.
Right.
And it was an idea that we had talked about a bunch, and we had sort of, had some length of discussion on and figured out some of the implementation for, but it wasn't something that we were immediately working on or whatever. And then you see something like Vindicor posted, and he had some really great variations on that idea. So, in those kind of cases, we would almost always think like, hey, how can we integrate some of these community ideas into this other sort of wider idea or wider initiative that we're trying to do? And then, whenever we could, we would try to give those people credit for, helping to expand the design or grow the design in a new direction or whatever. And that happened quite frequently when we would be working on a new system, getting feedback from players, while we wouldn't always necessarily see some kind of brand new out of the blue idea for a system that had never been thought of before. We would get some piece of feedback and say, oh, you know what, we talked about this a little bit, but this person really argued it the right way. That's the reason why it's the right way to do this. We should do it that way.
Right. You've said a lot of things. You're saying a lot of things. I almost want to like backtrack a little bit. Let's talk about like, so you're saying ideas are great, right? But there comes a time when you have to actually make it into something, right? And that involves art, involves coding, involves all kinds of things that is being outside the industry I'm not aware of. But like, I remember at SOE Live in 2013, you guys had talked about, you're just bringing it up, like the intercontinental lattice, the Nexus was kind of like up and down. So like, what was it 2 years ago? Like, what was it that prevented those things from actually seeing, at least the PTS, if anything, or coming to the live server? Like, what is it that kind of affects the priorities, or what's like, who controls? Obviously, it's the producer that controls the shift. But why is it that some things like just don't happen? At least from the community standpoint, or like a player standpoint.
Well, in terms of like who controls the shift and why, it's a big discussion. So the overall prioritization of what went into the game more or less would come down to what I wanted to add. That was probably the most important component. what like execs and marketing needed in terms of monetization, and then kind of what the overall consensus of what the team wanted to work on too. So towards the end of the project, we had basically moved over to where, in terms of large scale direction of what we were going to be doing to build the game, we were more or less having the entire team weigh in on stuff that we wanted to add to the game and figure out the kind of order that those pieces would go in. And sometimes we would get intervention from off the team, but for the most part, it was very driven by what the team wanted to add. And that was usually based on goals like we need to do more to shore up the new player experience, or we need to maybe do something to increase monetization this month because our numbers were down last month. So we would be getting kind of large goals and large sort of requests for specific things to happen in the game. But in terms of your specific question of why do things like the intercontinental lattice not come through, I think one of your questions on your list was what do you kind of regret about the game, or what would you change if you could change one thing about the game?
Right.
This isn't necessarily something about the game, but definitely about the way that I talked about the game. I think it was hard to determine the difference between like promises, this is happening, we are doing this right now, versus sort of dreams that we had for what the game could be and things that we wanted to add to the game. And I think that we never really had a good enough line on that. And even when we did things like put stuff on the roadmap, in a lot of cases the roadmap wasn't even, hey, this thing is coming in March. In so many cases that was definitely something we wanted to do. It wasn't like we put it on there just for a bullshit reason. But in a lot of times we would come like across, maybe a technical problem, maybe a programmer got called for jury duty for 2 weeks, or maybe another project really needed a specific expertise, so we lost an asset, and that shifted the priorities around. And that kind of stuff happened quite a bit. But the biggest difference, and I think one of the things that was really, really kind of hard for any team to deal with, is the shift when you go from being a in development project to being a live project. So before you launch, it's easy to talk about big plans that you have for things and these big changes that you're going to do. But as soon as the game launches, your priorities basically change instantly. You are now responsible for this thing that you have to keep alive, basically. A lot of people compare launching a game to having a baby or giving birth. And I use that comparison a lot because it's, I think, pretty apt. It's very painful and very exciting. But,
Well, hopefully you've never personally experienced that.
I've experienced one aspect of it, I suppose, but I don't remember much of that. But, as soon as you have it, you're now responsible for that thing. You can't let it die.
Right.
You have to take care of it or you're in trouble. And it's the same thing with the game. Like once you launch it and it's a live product and people are spending money on it, like if there's a question of, hey, should we fix this issue with the thing, or should we keep building this brand new crazy thing? The answer is always fix the problem with the underlying thing.
Right.
So in terms of like, there was a lot of game systems that I wish that we had actually shipped the game with that we didn't. And I kind of foolishly thought, post-launch, it's going to be, 2 or 3 months. At the pace that we've been adding stuff to the game before we launch the game, it'll be 3-4 months. We'll have these new systems in and everything will be great. But when the game actually ships, all bets are off. And now you suddenly are beholden to solving problems, and anything that's not, if the problems are big enough, anything that's not solving those problems is on hold until the problems get solved. So that's just kind of the truth about running a live project, and that's just how it goes.
Yeah, it's almost kind of, it sounds what you're saying, it's almost kind of like Sisyphean, right? Like you get to the top of the hill, all of a sudden the rock goes down, and you have to start all over again. Sounds like
it felt like that a lot.
Yeah,
no, it felt like that a lot. And this is something that, I'm not rolling the rock up the hill at all in a lot of these cases. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like I'm sitting here complaining about these problems, but it certainly wasn't me doing the effort on trying to solve them. You know,
Right.
this was something that engineers were working their asses off trying to solve, and continue to work their asses off trying to solve. Really, really smart, hardworking people. Um, but the shift in terms of, hey, you know what, we can be working on building out these big systems, to suddenly have to now be, oh, these things get interrupted
Right.
anytime that something comes up on live, or hey, the only resource that can work on this thing is also the only person who can make weapons actually function. So if we have a problem with hit registration on live, guess what? It's going to take a really long time for whatever outfit recruitment or whatever system you thought
Right.
that programmer was going to be working on to get finished. So that stretched out our time frame quite a bit, and it meant that systems that I thought we would have been able to get in very rapidly post-launch ended up taking a very long time, and in a lot of cases are still just non-existent in the game. And that to me was always like a really big bummer. And as it started getting longer and longer for those things to get finished, like I felt like my job was more and more about doing the community focused thing and less about like, hey, here's these brand new systems, because we already had so many plans for so many new
Right.
systems in place. We just didn't have the horsepower to knock them out. And so, like, kind of going back to your first question, why did I want to leave Daybreak right now? Like, I looked at the next year of work that's going to be done, and it's really important work that needs to get done on a project right now. Solidifying the servers, getting and
Right.
a lot of it's actually being done very quickly. I know that they've been doing some updates, and I was playing this morning, and the game was playing fucking phenomenally. I was in a giant fight, and the game was running great. So these are all things that I have the utmost faith are going to be solved, and they're going to be solved quickly.
Right.
But they're not going to be solved by me, and no design in the world is going to be able to get them solved. So, like, for
It's
my
like
job to
a brick
just be
wall.
basically informing players, here's the new things that are coming in terms of technical solutions and stuff like that, isn't really, it's not what I kind of signed up to do. And it felt like right now those guys need to work on getting the server solidified.
Right.
The PS4 launch needs to get done. All of those are really big, very important projects, but those have very, very little to do with my skill set and the
Right.
work that I was doing for the team.
So kind of like what you were saying, and kind of going back to your analogy of like a baby, right? Essentially, you created this thing, but you have to really nurture it, pay attention. It almost seems though like a lot of, if you look at the history, and I'm kind of just generally thinking about it, the history of the patches in PlanetSide 2, a lot of it was like reiterations, right? Like how many times I think each continent got done twice. The infantry gunplay, which is awesome now, constantly got touched, adjusted, touched, adjusted. Like
Yeah.
how much room is there now in PlanetSide 2, creatively speaking, right, to do something new? Right? Because a lot of the cool things that even Burness and stuff are mentioning are old. They're not novel things, right? It's all PlanetSide One stuff. Like, is there any room based on the workload, based on what you know about the team? Is there any room really to get something like innovative, brand new into PlanetSide Two?
Yeah, man, there is. There's no lack of headroom in PlanetSide 2. That's one of the things that makes it such an exciting project to work on. Such an exciting, I think, project for people to play. Like as a player, I'm excited about it too, because there is nothing but potential. It's just sky high in terms of what can get done. And like I said, right now their priorities are, solidification, getting everything running and working really, really well, getting the console launches out of the way, and getting that new audience playing the game. But beyond that, and even while they're working on that stuff, there's so much cool shit that can be going on. You guys, if you're following like Chris Bishop's Twitter account, or Bill Yates's Twitter account, or Brian's Twitter account, they've been tweeting out some teasers of things that they're working on, and they're working on all kinds of really interesting stuff. There's some cool art assets that have just been coming in that I'm excited about as a player, to see the impact that they're going to have on the game and the things that they're going to do in the game. But again, all those things got requested like 9 months ago.
Right.
So the actual inception, I guess, of those things creatively was something that Trammell and I worked on, like
Right.
seriously, in like summer of last year. So that's the kind of lead time I think that a lot of these things have. So they right now have the ability to do so many really, really cool and interesting things. Like you were saying that Brian's been talking about doing LLU stuff. There's no limit to the amount of kind of ideas that people have had for different ways to do base capture, different kind of alerts. It's really just a matter of what players want to see next and what the team wants to focus on next.
Right.
And a lot of that stuff has been written down in terms of ideas from people like myself, people like Malorn when he was on the team, some of the other designers who left the team recently, who had been involved in writing a lot of different systems designs. And then beyond that, I mean, the team that's there is really, really smart, capable, creative. They have lots of good ideas for things to add to the team too. So, whether we see big changes that are things that I could predict because they were ideas that came about when I was on the team, or they're brand new, completely, out of left field changes that are just coming from the team itself. I think there's a lot of potential for really cool, exciting stuff coming out of there. For
Okay,
sure.
so let's it was kind of the question you were saying. I think you said that I had asked like, what do you regret? Well, let's take the other side of it. Like, say you can push a button, right? And all of a sudden you have unlimited resources, like the best talent in the industry, all the time in the world. What would PlanetSide ideally to you look like?
That's a that's an intimidating question because you're saying if I had unlimited talent and unlimited budget, like I certainly wouldn't know what to do with that. You require a really fucking smart person to deal with unlimited talent and unlimited budget. That's beyond me, well beyond me. But man, I don't know. The most critical things to me, if we had been able to ship the game with a functional mission system, which to me was the system that was supposed to connect people who understood how the game worked with people who had no idea how the game worked, create waypoints, create like activities for them to do. If we had shipped with that system, a real strategic resource system and some real strategic base benefits, I would have been really, 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 really content with where the game was. And I don't think that it necessarily requires unlimited talent and unlimited design, ability and unlimited budget or any of that kind of stuff to be able to do those things. The most important thing would have just been able to launch with a completely solid, figured out, fully understood, totally vetted underlying technology. That was one of the things with PlanetSide 2 that was always kind of a challenge. Was we were developing the Forge Light engine, which is just, I think the people have this weird need to be sarcastic about stuff, but the Forge Light engine is a really, really, really cutting edge piece of technology. It does things in terms of network technology that no other game engine in the world can do. But we were developing that engine and defining the needs of that engine at the same time that we were trying to develop a commercial product against it. And that's definitely something that's very challenging. So being able to separate out those two things would have been a great benefit of having an unlimited budget. Being able to have more engineers dedicated completely to the engine development effort, and then have engineers dedicated completely to building a game on top of that engine instead of having to sort of share goals, would have been a really wonderful thing to have if you had unlimited talent.
Right.
But in the real world, I think what we were able to do without unlimited budget and without limitless talent, although I would say that the talent that we had was astounding on
Yeah.
PlanetSide 2, to be able to get that project launched in 18 months with the absolute audacity of the goals of the project is something that I think is really, really, really underappreciated by a lot of people. But
Right.
The things that were achieved, I think were pretty incredible and continue to be pretty incredible, because the work that they've done recently in terms of getting that game working well on the PlayStation 4 has been some of the most impressive feats of engineering on the project so far. So they continue to do astounding things, even though morale in a lot of cases can be bad. I'm not going to sugarcoat, when you have layoffs and stuff, morale is going to
Right.
be impacted. A lot of people lost friends, and that was painful for tons of people. At the end of the day, everybody who's going into that office in the morning is working on something that no one has ever worked on before, and is doing something that no one else is doing anywhere else. People are always saying like, when's the next MMO FPS going to come out? And like, actually,
Probably never.
I can't wait for the next one. And it's like, well, you're going to have to, because there's not a lot of them being worked on right now. And that's because it's just a completely astounding technical feat to be able to make a game like this. The guys that are working on porting it to the PS4 are doing some incredible things, and the dudes who are continuing to work on building the game for the PC, same deal.
So let's talk a little bit about the PS4. I think it's really interesting because I'm sure you've watched some of the streams, right? Like these guys or girls, whoever are playing, and it's almost like how we were on day one, right, on release. Although maybe the expectations were a little higher because PC Master Race and all that. But on the PS4, it's like when you see them and like they're like, holy shit! Like once that settles down, essentially once the dust settles, how do you think the PS2 will do on the PS4? Once that initial, because that hype is always going to be there. But actually, I think once that dies down, like what do you think is going to happen?
I'm very bullish on the PS4. The PS4 launching on the PS4 is going to do a couple really really cool things for PlanetSide. One, it's going to open up a very large new revenue stream. I think the potential PS4 revenue stream is larger than the potential PC revenue stream for this game right now.
Oh yeah, just looking
Just
at
based
Call
on
of
the size
Duty.
of the audience and how
Yeah,
hungry they are for a game, I think that the initial revenue stream is very very good. That's money that can help a team that desperately needs, uh, a morale boost, and also really needs to be able to justify bringing new people back to work on new features and work on new additions to the game. So that revenue stream, I think, is going to be very critical. I also think that another benefit that you're getting right away is a bunch of engineers that are coming back to work on the game again. So you're getting a lot of people coming back who are now working on the port, who are going to be able to get game systems work, server work. They're going to be back to work on doing things for the entire PlanetSide 2 ecosystem, not just the specific PS4 port.
right.
So I think those two things combined are going to mean a lot for PlanetSide 2 once it launches on the PS4. And like I said earlier, my timing right now probably couldn't be worse, because I really do think that PlanetSide 2 is about to rebound in a very dramatic fashion by launching on the PS4. And I think the people who are there working on it are going to reap a lot of rewards for that.
Yeah, and let's talk about like kind of going back to the PS4 players. They're gonna get like there's nothing like this, right, on the PS4. That's not even hyperbole. It's just fact, right? There's nothing like PlanetSide 2, where it's a true combined arms game. But even within the PC, like when you talk about combined arms, you're basically having to deal with almost three different crowds, right? Your armor crowd, your air crowd, and your infantry crowd. How, as a designer, or even as like pushing stuff out to the game, did you balance that? Or like did that even come into like consideration when you guys are pushing like maybe new weapons, or you were like adjusting like the Dolan to be this and not this? Like were you looking at the whole picture? I mean, or like what did that look like?
It was very, very difficult. Balancing a combined arms game already is very challenging. Balancing a asymmetrically balanced combined arms game is enormously challenging. And balancing a game for which there's no limits on any type of anything. You can have unlimited bombers, you can have unlimited planes, you can have unlimited tanks. You're just compounding the complexity of the task. So I think the way that we approached it in general was to kind of silo things off a little bit, just purely for sanity's sake, and make sure that infantry combat, class versus class combat, the balance of the infantry classes against one another, the availability of the weapons across empires felt good. And we would look at it as small as we needed to or as big as we needed to. Do the default carbines feel balanced across each one of the empires? Okay, cool. What about medics? What about the entire medic arsenal? Does that feel balanced across empires? And you kind of expand out from there. As soon as you start to feel like you have a pretty good handle on a quadrant of gameplay, hey, infantry combat feels widely balanced, then you start looking at your next quadrant, vehicle gameplay or air gameplay, and you kind of have to balance the importance of those things on a couple factors: the complexity of solving the problems, the impact of the problems to the overall game. So, a lot of times pilots and vehicle players have said, hey, you know what, we don't feel like our problems have been solved, with the same sort of ferocity as the infantry problems got solved. And in a lot
Right.
of cases, they're probably right. And that's because it's more of a niche playstyle. So the impact of a 5% imbalance in tank secondary weapons, a lot fewer people feel that than the impact of a 5% imbalance in medic default weapons or something like that. You know what I mean? So you kind of have to look at each one and prioritize each one of those verticals, I guess. You can kind of look at them as being a balanced vertical. Here's vehicle balance, here's infantry balance, here's air balance. You have to balance each one of those in and of themselves. And then you start looking at the crosses in between them. How does the infantry versus air gameplay feel? Do you feel like you have enough options as an infantry player to be able to counter air gameplay? Do you feel like you don't have enough? And I think a lot of our early balance mistakes were in the connective tissue in between the balance verticals, and I think they still kind of continue to be to this day.
Right. Just not. It's not as bad as release date Daltons or Zephyrs. That's for sure.
Exactly,
That
but
was a nightmare.
the Liberators are an interesting example because I remember we were having a lot when we were first balancing the Liberator post launch. It was kind of our first big test in terms of, hey, here's a big piece of the game now that's obviously severely imbalanced. What do we want to try to do to set the tone for how we approach balance issues in the future? And I remember, Kevmo and Josh Sanchez and I had some pretty in-depth discussions about what we were going to do with this fucking thing because it was causing a lot of people to be pissed off. There were already people who were fucking flying up the battle ranks by just rolling around with Zephyrs all day long. Excuse me. And we knew we needed a solution, but we also knew, one, we'd taken money for a lot of these things. People bought these, Daltons and stuff,
Right.
and Zephyrs because they wanted to be killing stuff with them. So they had made a lot of money. So we didn't really want to be making any kind of crazy nerfs to these things. And two, we wanted to, in general, be doing nudges rather than big pendulum swings in terms of balancing. And that was always something that we wanted to do, but calibrating how hard you have to kick something that has an unknown mass and like a barely known velocity when it's heading towards you is tough, right? Like learning how hard you have to kick that thing to be able to it's like kicking a basketball and sinking a basket from across court, When you're talking about pendulum swinging, it's just hard to know how much force you have to push stuff with sometimes. So we had a lot of weird pendulum swings and balance, but it was never because we wanted to really knock the thing all the way to the other end. It was just because we never had our force calibrated correctly.
So, like, how much time?
But anyway, going back to the Liberator, like the initial changes that we made to the Liberator were all about the way that the weapon felt and increasing the skill ceiling on it. So the very first changes we made were increasing the gravity a shitload on it. So that if you were like hovering way off to the edge of a base, if you remember when we launched, they didn't have any gravity. They just fucking shot.
Right.
So you could be way off on the other side of a base and just be shelling over to the other side of it, and it was no problem at all. You didn't have to compensate for gravity. You didn't have to be above it where you were in threat at all. So we made some changes there that instead of just nerfing the weapon and making the weapon be impotent, we tried to make it so that in order to use the weapon well, you had to put yourself in a lot more threat. And I think that was our first real big balance change that we were making. And I think that we, in terms of philosophy, came up with the philosophy that ended up sort of guiding our changes that we made henceforth. It wasn't a perfect adjustment, and it's hard to make a perfect adjustment with any kind of weird, crazy balance change in PlanetSide 2 when you're talking about, hey, here's air gameplay interacting with both ground infantry and what it's supposed to be interacting with, which is ground armor. How do we make sure that it can still do ground armor without being so deleterious to the ground infantry gameplay? That was a big challenge, and I feel like the changes that we made specifically were kind of nudging it in that direction. And in general, I think that the changes that we've made in balance largely have been trying to subtly shift things instead of trying to do the sledgehammer fix, except for when sledgehammer fixes were basically the only way out of a situation because something that we did was so wrong before that it needed to have just a massive adjustment.
Yeah, I can think of like the harassers, where like they had like 3 or 4 adjustments in one patch, and
Right.
but like
Yeah, I mean,
like
the harasser was another thing, right? I mean, that was the first time we'd ever added a brand new vehicle like that to the game, and what sort of effects would that have on a pretty well established ground armor gameplay? It really threw things out of whack. I think that now, if the harasser was 50% of the way between where it is right now and where it was when we launched, it probably wouldn't be a problem at all because people are used to it. But when you introduce that thing for the very first time and have it be as crazy powerful as it was, it's very disruptive, and it causes a lot of pain. And that's why I think you saw when we released the Valkyrie, we went the other direction with it. Instead of
yeah.
trying to like nail it and put it right on where we think the balance needs to be for it, we were like, let's kind of underpower it a little bit in a couple different ways. And then in a couple months we can revisit it. And I know that Kevmo already had a whole bunch of changes for its stage, which I think are probably getting ready for the next live update. So there are going to be some changes coming for that thing.
So like when we're talking about like nudging, and you said a lot of really interesting things about how like you design the system, you're looking at all these metrics, right? You're looking at just at numbers, but how it feels, right? Like were there some things that you guys created and pushed to life server? You're like, holy crap, what did we do, right? Like did that ever come into mind? Like with Zoe, like did you guys know that Zoe was going to be so strong, or that harassers were going to be so, or like how much time after they actually released, we were like, okay, well let's adjust this, let's look back to this.
Zoe was a really weird case, right? So I think Zoe gets kind of hung on our necks a lot as being a big balance mistake, and rightfully so. But before Zoe got released, if you remember reading the threads back then, almost everybody was basically saying this is just going to be worthless. Like, there's no way I'm going to use this
Yeah,
stupid.
that's the hilarious part about it, right?
Yeah, exactly. So like we were like, fuck, man, is this? Do we need to buff this thing and make it stronger before it went live? And then we knew it was really strong. I remember talking to Brian Burness, who you guys all know now, but probably didn't know then. But he was working on getting those abilities functional, and he was doing some things that he didn't necessarily want to do, that he was being kind of forced to do by me, saying make it do this,
Right.
just to sort of give him an out. But I wanted that ability to be all about maneuverability and to have weakened defenses, essentially. I think the biggest flaw with that ability was that we didn't give it a proper activation slash fuel slash some sort of downside in terms of using it and being committed to using it instead of just turning it on and off whenever you wanted to. Because people being able to flick it on and off and dodge like take a rocket hit with it turned off, I think really made it be introduced poorly.
Like,
But in general, like maxes, and I know you had a question later on about maxes, and we can talk
yeah.
about it more. But maxes were something that were out of the bounds of the way the game was balanced in general. The infantry combat was balanced in a certain way that maxes didn't necessarily fit cleanly within. And trying to balance around maxes has sort of always been an issue. And I think that the center of that issue is the abilities. Max abilities need a refinement. And that's something that we talked about a lot before I left. And I'm sure it's something that I know Brian cares a lot about too. So it's something that hopefully we'll get to see in the near future at some point.
Now, did you guys decide going into like development to have maxes only because it was like like the PlanetSide thing, or did you understand that hey we might have problems but we're just going to go with it anyway? Like what was that decision? Because I know like you said maxes are kind of like a huge outlier, right?
Yeah, Josh, who was our combat designer, did not want to put maxes in, and I forced him to put maxes in. Like that's why we have maxes. I was basically like, these are iconic from PlanetSide. We have to have maxes. It was one of two iconic from PlanetSide
Right.
arguments that I made. The other of which is why we have Vanu in the game, because initially it was a 2-faction game.
Oh, I didn't know that.
TS Next was going to be NC and TR only. And when we took over and decided to make PlanetSide 2, I was like, listen, we have to have Vanu. It has to be 3 factions. They are a critical component of what makes PlanetSide PlanetSide.
Right.
And the other one where I kind of refused to budge on it and said, we need to do it like this. No, we're not making PlanetSide over again, but this has to be here as maxes. And I do think that maxes actually play a very important quasi vehicle in a combined arms game. I think that the max is a very critical unit because you need to have a hardened infantry unit to be able to compete with vehicle zergs in a lot of cases. I don't think the max is perfectly calibrated in terms of what its benefits versus what its like capabilities are right now. I don't think it's in perfect calibration. I think it's decently balanced considering how much of a weird outlier it is to the actual game balance itself.
So, like, where would you like to see that? Because I know there's a lot of arguments, and like I've read some things, and I think one of the primary arguments, as far as like where maxes are, is like right now, obviously they do too much damage. They do too much damage. They take too much damage. A lot of people are saying potentially putting them into like more of like a utility role, right? Kind of
Yeah.
being like a support thing. Like how difficult is that? And even when you go back to saying how like when Zoe came out, it was super strong. How difficult is it to go back and actually change those numbers, to change how things work?
Well, making adjustments, like the actual physical act of changing stuff, is very simple. I mean, it's a
Right,
data table. We have nice tools that allow us access to all the relevant fields. It's not hard at all. The hard part is figuring out what you actually want it to do, and then figuring out what you need to change to make it do those things. That is fucking hard to do in a lot of
right,
cases, especially because maxes exist within a framework that was designed for infantry. They have hit points that's more similar to vehicles. In terms of like the max specific mechanics that we spent time really doing stuff just for maxes, there's a handful of things. There's the dual weapons mechanic. Um, and that's probably honestly hit, except for any specific work that needed to get done for the abilities. They didn't
right,
have a lot of like, hey, we need to make this aspect of the game that's completely unique and completely separate from infantry and completely unique and completely separate from vehicles. They didn't get that kind of attention. So they're shoehorned into infantry. Um, in terms of how hard it is to change the numbers of things, simple. To change the actual function of things or to make them work better, it's kind of harder. And Kevmo and I talked a lot about maxes, and I think maxes and main battle tanks suffer from the same problem, which is they need to have better abilities that synergize better with the platform, the underlying platform. And the problem is, in a lot of cases, like we needed more mechanics support to be able to change the abilities in the ways that made sense. So without that support, it was hard for us to make the kind of adjustments that we thought that they needed to make. So rather than just, swapping numbers around or whatever to try to change something, we kind of left them alone since they were in a pretty decent spot of balance. Like I think
right,
about balance as being this perfect thing, but then sometimes you have wobbly balance where it doesn't like completely clunk and fall over on one side, but it kind of just, maybe it kind of, if there's a
right.
stiff wind, it kind of blows back and forth a little bit. And that's not perfect, but wobbly balance is better than fucking with wobbly balance sometimes if you don't have a
Right.
solution that can put it into perfect balance. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so I'm going to ask you a really stupid question. Bear with me. Is it even possible to balance a game like PlanetSide with so many variables and with the current resource system? Is that even like, and we're talking about, like you said, like this kind of perfect idea of balance. Is that even possible?
Probably not. I don't think that there's any game. If you want to have a game with differences um, between teams, essentially, any sort of differences between teams, you're not going to be able to have a perfectly balanced game. And the reason why it's not perfectly balanced will change over time as people figure things out. But as long as I have access to, uh, you know, square-sized rocks and you have access to round-sized rocks, you and I are going to spend every minute of our lives trying to figure out how to get the most out of our square-sized rocks and how to minimize their round-sized rocks. You know what I mean? So even if they start off weighing exactly the same, at some point the metagame between me and you throwing rocks at each other is going to shift to the point where shit, I can no longer do anything because his round-sized rocks can kill me before I can get close enough to use my square-sized rocks
Right.
because mine are square. So even though any sort of difference, I think, creates an imbalance, and that imbalance can be marginalized and it can be minimalized to the point that people can live within that imbalance. And I actually think PlanetSide 2 is at a point right now where, especially on the infantry side, the imbalances are very marginalized. The things that people complain about in terms of infantry balance right now are such infinitesimal advantages that it's just like, it's like, who fucking gives a shit? Okay, yeah, the Orion is a better LMG than the other LMGs are. Great. Yeah, it's a 0.00001% difference. And yeah, maybe one day yours will be 0.00001% better than the
Yeah.
Orion. But it's like, it's so meaningless that it just doesn't matter.
And you
Um,
bring up an amazing point because you're saying that essentially, if I'm better at you with this gun, regardless of what it is, if I'm just better than you, I can make my square rock essentially kill you, even though you have your circle rock, right? To use your analogy. But I think a lot of people focus on that 0.001% and say, just because I'm stuck with this square rock, I'm never going to win. And so you
well,
get
that's
like, why do you
that's
think
just
that happens? Like, why is that attitude pretty prevalent in PlanetSide 2?
Well, there's all sorts of different psychological theories for why people tend to blame the thing instead of blaming themselves, right? Like that's Dunning-Kruger effect. There's all sorts of different things like that that are, hey, you know what? It's not my problem. It's this thing that's obviously fucked up. I think PlanetSide 2 is interesting, right? So PlanetSide 2 is an FPS game. You log into it and it feels and acts and plays just like an FPS game. If you've played any other FPS in the last 10 years, you can jump into it and you can play it.
Right.
But it's not a fucking FPS game
No,
the same way, right?
that
So
lasts
like
like maybe 5 minutes.
when you jump in and you play Dota, you play Heroes of the Storm, you play a MOBA game, right? Like the first time you jump into it, you're looking at it and you're like, hey, you know what? This kind of feels like Diablo a little bit. It kind of feels like Warcraft a little bit, but it's different. Something's off here. Like I need to figure out what's going on. And your first thought is, I need to learn what this is. Even though I'm kind of familiar with it, it's unfamiliar in some way to me. With PlanetSide 2, I think we actually made it feel so much like an FPS game that a lot of people jumped into it and were just like, this is a shitty FPS game. Like, there's no dudes around for me to kill. I got to walk a mile to be able to get there, because it felt exactly like the other FPS games they played. We made it feel like an FPS. So people jumped in and they didn't immediately think, oh, I need to learn something different. I need to figure out how this is different in terms of an experience than the other games that I've played before. They just thought, I'm going to try to play this like I'm used to. And if it doesn't play that way, that means that they fucked up, not me. And I'm not saying we didn't. Of course, we made plenty of mistakes.
Right.
But I think that kind of attitude actually kind of impacted us to some degree.
Yeah, and that's actually an awesome segue. I was going to say, because like typically fights, we all know how they run, right? You attack a base, you eventually have more numbers, and then the defenders get stuck in the spawn room. Like knowing that that happens, like how much do you think it is your responsibility, or was your responsibility as dev, to kind of promote ways for people to get out of that situation, and how much of it was just really just people, I mean, for lack of a better term, just not really trying, really, I guess. Like I don't know how else to word it.
Well, I think so. Okay, I'll go back to using Dota as an analogy again. Dota was a really hard game to play, and anybody who played Dota back when it was a Warcraft 3 mod and really got into it understood that it was a magical game that was completely unique and completely interesting, really fun, really interesting, deep,
Right.
expansive game. But it was hard to get into. I think the brilliance of the commercial applications of Dota that you see now is that they figured out how to make it so that new players, when they first log in, are not frustrated by that new player experience, can actually peel back the layers of why this is a different experience and actually get to the core of what makes it be unique. And I don't think that we necessarily did an adequate job in that in PlanetSide 2, just because there were so many weird sort of pitfalls that a player could get trapped in that would frustrate them, all the way starting from, you know, performance problems to the size of the download to the fucking launch pad is super shitty.
Right.
Like there's all kinds of different things all the way up and down the path that are pitfalls that a player could get stuck in. And you know, for all the things that we did very well in terms of building great, again, audacious, groundbreaking products, I don't feel like we gave enough attention and care to creating that polished sort of on-ramp for players to be able to learn the experience and learn the game. And when I look at games like Dota 2 and League of Legends, and I look at the enormous amount of success that those games have, I see that as being a success in terms of creating a more approachable experience than what Warcraft was able to do, or what Dota was able to do as a Warcraft mod. And so my aspirations were very frequently, in terms of like wanting to expand the player base, my aspirations were almost always kind of centered on, we need to be making the on-ramping experience be a much cleaner and more understandable and more digestible experience for new people coming in, so that if they are spawning at a Sunder that's getting camped, like there's a warning sign that's flashing on their spawn screen and saying, hey, be careful, this fucking thing is dangerous as shit.
Right,
You
right.
shouldn't spawn here. And there's a variety of ways to approach that, right? You can approach that through creating just more training wheels type systems, like a flashing danger sign that's flashing whenever you're trying to respawn at a location. Or you could create that through things like the mission system and creating a tool that allows the more experienced players to, create objectives and create meaningful roles for the less experienced players on the battlefield. You know, and that was the approach that I always sort of wanted to go down, was rather than having the game tell players what to do, rather than having a game mechanic stand between two players being able to compete with each other, let's figure out how many game mechanics we can completely remove. like what can we get rid of? And that was sort of the initial design behind the influence system and hexes was let's not have mechanics be able to say only this base can attack this other base here. Let's have it be something where it's free up to the players to be able to choose, but there's
Right.
advantages and disadvantages to being able to do it. But the problem is like I think in a lot of cases when you add too much in terms of player choice and you rely too much on player choice to be able to create any sort of structure, you end up with just like a breakdown, and it makes it very difficult for newer players to sort of understand stuff. So while for a long time I was thinking the solutions like the mission system and more open-ended gameplay um, were really the solution, and in a lot of ways I still think that those things are a eventual sort of end result of creating a lot of good gameplay systems. You
Right.
can get to the point where you have the very open-ended systems at the end for the experts to be able to use. I still think you need to have a more guided and game-driven new player experience to sort of on-ramp people, because you can't always rely on there being a really good leader grabbing every single new player at the warp gate and like holding their hand as they learn how their class works. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's
So
pretty
that's why we
rare.
build things like Cold Tier. That's why we build things like the first time event system, just to sort of be those training wheels that eventually fall off and allow the players to then hopefully join in using outfit recruitment and missions and finding good leaders that are going to teach them good practices. And then eventually they get into the heart of what makes the game really special, which is working together with other players and accomplishing big goals with big groups of people and all those other things that we love so much about PlanetSide.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the why I'm interested in the release on PS4 is because of how unique the game is, right? Now, but speaking about new player stuff, do you think that Cold Tier will help kind of bridge that gap between what you're saying, like essentially like the people that, well, actually the PS4 you're not going to have people who know everything that you're doing, right? It's not like the PC where somebody jumping into PlanetSide 2 is going to fly against like one of the best live pilots in the game. They have no chance.
Right.
PS4 they're kind of on even ground. But do you think Cold Tier is kind of like bridging that gap, kind of helping people out? Was that the goal of it?
Well, there's a couple different things that Cold Tier is going to do. First, Cold Tier is going to be smaller in terms of total population. So it'll let people get familiar with the mechanics and some of the specifics of how you interact with the world and what like equipment terminals and vehicle terminals, all those kind of concepts are kind of foreign to a lot of FPS players. They don't exist in other games.
Right.
So Cold Tier is going to allow you to sort of get used to all those concepts in a slightly smaller scale with more sort of tightly packed objectives where you're not going to have to worry about navigating across an entire map to be able to get to where you need to learn how to fight. So, I mean, that's really what Cold Tier is all about. It's the experience in a nutshell, condensed down so that people can jump into it, hopefully have a fun time faster, and learn the basics of how they get around once they get exposed to the larger world. So I think that Cold Tier can help out quite a bit. Yeah. And I also think Cold Tier, I was talking to Xander about this the other day, and it was kind of bittersweet because he was saying that he thought that Cold Tier, in terms of level design, was the best thing that he's worked on so far.
Yeah,
So
it has bases never seen before in the game, right?
yeah, it has some really cool stuff going on, and I think that he got a chance to really like innovate some sort of interesting concepts and work on some things that he hadn't really had a chance to work on before. So he was excited about that, and he also got some really unique new props and new buildings that he had been wanting for a long time that he actually was able to get for the tutorial zone, but he wasn't able to get before. So he was really excited about that, and it was kind of a bummer because he was one of the people who got let go. I say kind of, I mean like absolutely a fucking heart-wrenching bummer, but he he was really excited about that zone and some of the things that they had done with it. So I can potentially see the idea of us opening that up as some sort of platoon versus platoon zone,
Yeah.
or even like a platoon versus platoon zone, and having like some cool fights happening on them or doing some server smash shit on them in the future. The sky's the limit on that kind of stuff.
Yeah. There's actually a question, and I wanted to ask you this before. I think you sat on a Sony panel, right? You're talking about FTP. There was a free to play, right? There's a guy from Warframe. There was a guy from I think World of Tanks. There was you, a couple other people.
Yeah,
Like, but like the whole like going back and looking at it now, like, do you think it was a better decision that it went free to play, or if it was sub based, do you think you would have had a lot more leeway as far as like what you could create with the game, or is that even possible to answer because it's really just like a lot of unknowns, right?
it's difficult to answer for sure. I think free to play as a business model it has a lot of advantages and has a lot of disadvantages. Um, one of the things that I love about free to play is it's, to me at least, it feels very honest. You know, you get to play my game, and if you like it, you can chip in a little bit of money here and there to be able to buy stuff. If you don't like it, you don't have to. But we didn't have to trick you. We didn't have to, make some trailer that has nothing to do with the game to get you to come and spend money. If you like it, if you think it's fun, you get to kick in a couple bucks to help us out. And I think that's really neat. One of the things that I dislike about free to play is I think that with a free to play game, you kind of have this freedom, I guess, to release a game that's not wouldn't typically cut the bar of being ready to go, right? Like you can have a game that is, you start thinking about a game in terms of like the minimum viable product. What is the least that this game has to be able to be something that's we can say is done. And from that point on, you start to look at, you are losing money by not having it live, by not having it commercialized at this point. You know what I mean?
Right, you're
And
just
once
spending man hours and all that stuff.
exactly, like there's a certain point where if you wanted to, and I'm not saying everybody does, I'm not saying there's pressure to, there's not like a line where it says, hey, this is the point where you have to make it
Right.
live or anything like that. But there's a certain point where you recognize, hey, we could be making money off of this right now. And from that point on, you're kind of like, there feels like there's a clock underneath you. You know what I mean? And most games, I think, very quickly switch into some sort of monetization at that point. And it's very easy to look at, if you kind of want to make the argument of, well, we should finish the game first. Like there's all these things that are missing. Then somebody can pipe up and say, well, all you have to do is look at and then insert any one of like a dozen fucking free to play games that make $1 million a minute that were completely unfinished when they launched, right? And boom, you insert that right into your sentence. And then afterwards you say they're doing very, very well with a completely unfinished feature set. So, and it's hard for you to refute that argument because with free to play games, there's sort of less of a, there's less of a, what's the right word? There's less to deter you from releasing an incomplete product than
Right.
releasing a game that has like a $50 box cost. And people expect it. With a free to play game, people expect that. I think that in a lot of ways, PlanetSide 2 has taught lessons in that regard. And I think that the way that like H1Z1 is doing the early access is quite a bit smarter. I think it's better for players. I think it's better for the team. They're basically saying, hey, you know what? We're not finished with this experience yet, but they can still make some money off of it. So they're not like completely stressed out about, hey, we need to make money right now, but we have an unfinished game.
Right.
They're able to be a little bit more of a, hey, here's our offering right now. We know it's not finished yet. And even with PlanetSide 2, I mean, we never said, hey, this is our finished game. It's done. We came out when we launched it and said, hey, you know what? We're not anywhere near being finished yet. Here's all these ideas we have. We want to hear your ideas. There's a lot that's going to change. There's a lot that's going to be added. There's a lot that's going to be finished with this game. And I feel like we were very upfront about that. But I still think that in a lot of cases, people don't necessarily hear that. Versus when you release a game with an early access tag on it, I think people kind of understand that a little bit more, and they're more willing to forgive things not working completely correctly right off the bat.
But do you think, honestly, that's a fair assessment, right? When you compare the free-to-play model in PlanetSide 2 compared to other games, the huge difference, at least to me as a player, is that PlanetSide 2, the instance is huge, right? You're talking about like 1,000 players, just throw a number out there. Whereas the instance in other free-to-play games are typically 5v5 or four-player co-op. So like I don't know if I'm wording it right, their architecture was way different. So was that a fair assessment to say just because they're earning all this money that all of a sudden we're going to do it, so let's push it? I know that earlier you said that between development and release, there's a huge shift in, or there's not a huge shift, but there's a shift in priorities. Do you think that was a fair assessment?
No, I mean, absolutely not. There's the difference in terms of like the technical requirements of any other free to play game you can think of, and PlanetSide 2. I mean, the differences are very stark. There's not another game that really does the kinds of things that PlanetSide 2 needs to do to work. And the complexity of the things that PlanetSide 2 needs to do to work is very high versus the complexity that, and again, this is nothing but praise for the teams that are behind these other games. I'm not saying
Right.
this to be like to denigrate them at all, but like the complexity of a game like League of Legends in terms of like the back end, their major complexity right now, just because they have such a massive game, is all their data gathering and how they do the metrics for how gigantic their audience is. The actual networking requirements of getting 5 versus 5 players to be able to play a game and have it work well, the back-end requirements for that are relatively simple compared to a game like PlanetSide 2. They have enormous technology needs in terms of just like they're managing this humongous audience, and they're trying to keep track of all that data and obviously all their store stuff. All those things add to that complexity, and those are problems that PlanetSide 2 had as well. But in terms of just mind-boggling technical requirements, the things that PlanetSide 2 is doing on a zone-by-zone basis are the scale of it is just,
Right.
there's nothing else that does it. Nothing else in the world.
So, like, as far as optimization goes, I know I'm kind of jumping around a little bit. Like, how much better can it get? How much tighter can optimization actually truly get with PlanetSide 2? At least on PC. Like, is there a limit, or can it keep going and going? Trimming off fat here, trimming off fat there.
Man, I'm not a programmer. I'm not an engineer.
Right, right.
So anything I tell you is going to be wrong by orders of magnitude, probably. Um, I think the biggest technology gains and the biggest problems that PlanetSide 2 has are just having to do with the number of players around. It doesn't have to do with the number of pixels being rendered. I mean, the number of pixels being rendered obviously doesn't fucking matter, but the number of polys being rendered, it doesn't have to do with, the shader complexity or anything like that. It has to do with number of dudes that are being tracked by your client,
Right.
number of dudes that are getting updates from the server. Those problems are, what's the correct word for it? Those problems are exponential problems. Each additional person you add is like another exponent that you're adding in terms of the complexity of trying to solve the networking problems there. So, the things like maybe being able to do some of the instancing stuff that's available in the newer versions of DirectX. Sure, I mean, that would make the GPU work be a lot lower.
Right.
It wouldn't necessarily make the game run significantly faster, because the amount of updates that you're getting in terms of animations and players moving around and all that kind of stuff honestly doesn't have a lot to do with the renderer. It has to do with a completely different piece of CPU intensive engineering that's in there. So, like I said, I'm not an engineer. I
Right.
feel uncomfortable like being able to say, hey, here's how much better it can get. I know that right now, like Josh Kriegshauser, who's the technical director on the project, he is one of the most hardworking, dedicated, like smartest. He's one of those guys who stays up all night solving just random problems that he happens to find. So in terms of optimizations that are possible, I guarantee that having a guy like Josh on the team means that they're going to get sniffed out and they're going to get found for however much percentage better the game could run. I have no fucking idea. I have no clue. I know that the hugest ones, the biggest things that we knew were optimization problems, we've continually tackled the biggest ones that we found, to the point where now the ones that we're tackling are marginal gains at most. Right. We're not getting any more like, hey, we fixed this thing and suddenly we have 50% faster frame rate. Like, I don't think that those type of unicorns exist anymore.
Okay. One last question. We're gonna close shop here pretty soon. I want to talk. I don't know why I hadn't asked you this before. Let's talk about PlanetSide really quick.
Okay.
Before it existed, right? Redeployment was way different, and then I guess it seemed to me, as the community asked for this and this and this, you guys essentially did it, right? And all of a sudden it was almost like the Zoe, right? With the Empress, people said I was always going to be weak. It came out strong. People wanted to redeploy side, but now nobody wants to redeploy side. Like, how? I mean, what do you think about that? Is that an accurate statement?
Kind of. I don't think. So one of the issues that we got hammered with a lot when we first launched the game, and this kind of goes back to things that we've done to try to make the game more new player friendly, was just people being bewildered by being able to see a big fight that they wanted to participate in, but not being able to like get to the fight. So making it easier for people to get to hot fights was a big goal that we had. That was a piece of feedback we've gotten from players a ton. And I mean, if you think about it, it's just annoying sometimes to have to jump into an airplane and fly over to a fight or whatever. So yeah, I mean, we absolutely made some of those changes to make those things be quicker and easier. Um, and in terms of what effects it's had on the game, I think that people are accurate in a lot of those. I think that one of the cool things about it is kind of going back to the pendulum swinging analogy, right? Like it's
Right.
swung in the other direction now to the point where it doesn't really need a lot of force to come back this way. It just sort of needs something to arrest it on the way back. You know what I mean?
Right.
So if they just make some very small adjustments, I think that they could probably, make some changes that allow redeploy to continue to be able to be used strategically in a way that isn't just a an automatic shortcut of any sort of strategic gameplay that can be going on. Uh, and I know for a fact that one of the things that's being worked on the PS4 in earnest is a new spawn system, and it's a new spawn system that's built on some different kind of heuristics in terms of determining locations that players can spawn at. And then instead of just like giving you the main spawn room, you can kind of look around region per region and then see all the available spawn points in that region. So if it's an attacking fight, rather than just hitting instant action to go to it, you can like view those fights and see how many friendly sunderers there are there, choose the sunderer you want to go to and spawn there that way. And that's going to be a different kind of experience for sure. And I think redeploy side is going to have to be sort of reanalyzed around that new experience.
That's interesting. It's almost like a hex-based spawn system within the lattice is what almost kind of what it sounds like.
It's yeah, I mean it's different. It's sort of like so right now instant action uses a variety of different factors to determine the location it's going to send you to. And it actually builds up a list of several different locations with a high percentage chance to send you to the top best fight and then a sort of lower percentage chance to send you to some other ones. And what we're actually doing, well, what they're actually doing, I keep saying we. See how this is still like, I'm having a very difficult time integrating that this is not my job.
Force a habit, man.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So what they were going to do and what we had been talking about doing, and maybe they'll do it or maybe they won't, who knows, was listing out each one of those fights, which are active fights in the world right
Right.
now. And then for each one of them, you basically can go region by region and just see all the spawns that are available there. So if there's a big fight, but there's no sunderers there, like you would be able to see that fight and then maybe see there's one sunderer there and be like, okay, I don't want to go to that one, but oh, this one has 6 sunderers. Okay, I can spawn here. So that was the design that was being kicked around back then, and that was kind of going to be the new PS4 spawning system that was eventually going to hopefully get moved over to the PC.
Sounds interesting, man. So, last question:
Lots of cool stuff going on.
what's next for you, man? Like, what's going on with your life as far as professionally goes? Like, what are you gonna do? Are you gonna stay in the games industry? Are you gonna get out of the games industry?
No, I'm definitely going to stay in the games industry, man. I don't know what else I would do with myself. I like making games a lot, and I like I said in that Reddit post, working on PlanetSide 2 has been not just like the coolest part of my career, it's been the coolest part of my life. It really, really has. Having players like actually give a shit about the things that you're doing has been one of the coolest parts about my career. Being able to travel around the world and talk about games has been just awesome. So I wouldn't imagine leaving the games industry at all. In terms of what I'm doing in the immediate term, right now, I mean, as I'm sure you guys have heard, the whole, the Daybreak situation and Sony Online, the split, they were really good to us. So, I have plenty of time to figure out what my next move is going to be now. So, I've been talking to some folks around here. I would love to stay down here in San Diego. I don't know if there's any sort of potential for that, but I've been sniffing around a little bit to see if there's some chance of something else starting up down here, potentially, and getting to work on stuff with some of my former colleagues. I've had some discussions with some folks about that. I've also talked to some people elsewhere in the industry about, maybe getting a gig someplace else. But right now, I'm mostly just kind of
Right.
trying to relax and get used to the fact that I wake up in the morning and I'm not going to the office. And it's weird because like every day I still wake up and I still go on the PlanetSide subreddit and I still, go read the forums first thing in the morning, and it's still sort of my morning ritual, and all the things that I cared about, like, I don't know, just a week ago, I still care so much about all of those things. When I see Brian sending out a tweet with like, something that he's working on talking about the next patch, or I saw Chris sending out the screenshots of some of the new TR weapons. I was still like, oh
Right.
shit, yeah, great, these are so cool. People love these. I still care about it a
Yeah.
lot. So it's I'm still kind of getting used to things, and we'll see. We'll figure it out.
Yeah, I think honestly, before we go on, to me, PlanetSide 2, or I don't know what it was. I don't know whether it was dev side, the community, or what it was, but it always felt like what you're saying right now, that it felt like a part, that you were a part of something. And I think really, like when I look at Reddit, that everybody kind of wants to be a part of this. I think it's really interesting because there's other games, like you talk about your League of Legends, millions of people, insane stadiums, but I don't get that same sense of like the way the community works, or interacting with the devs. So I think it was something really magical. I don't know if you guys did it on purpose or what, but I think to me, at least, that was pretty awesome.
Well, it's a really cool community, man, and it
Yeah.
started from I've said this before, and I think it's really really true. If you were a fan of the MMO FPS when PlanetSide came out in 2003, like nothing else came along for you. Nothing else came along to scratch that itch in 10 years. So we started off strong with a lot of people who really cared about the genre and really wanted to see more MMO FPS games and wanted to actually be able to, play a modern version of that game that they liked a lot. And it's been super gratifying to be able to have that kind of closeness and connection with players. The fact that there's people who actually care what I have to say, a week after I stopped working on the game, is it's cool. It's definitely unique, and I think that I'm excited for all the guys who are continuing to get to work on PlanetSide 2 because they're gonna continue to be able to build relationships with this community and develop the game with this community. And it's been just like I said, it's been the best part of my life. It's been really, really fun to do, and I've definitely enjoyed it. And I'm sad to leave it, but like I said, I would have been sad a year from now. I would have been sad 2 years from now, and now it's just the right time to do it.
All right. Well, with that, we're gonna end the show. I just want to say thanks a lot, Matt, for coming on and talking. I know
Yeah,
we've been
man.
here for like an hour, hour and a half. Thanks to everybody for showing up. I really do apologize about the drop frames, but hopefully the pod will be a lot smoother. So thanks again, man. Thank you,
Yeah.
everybody.
Thanks.